Well, good afternoon, uh, ladies, gentlemen, friends, and distinguished colleagues. My name is Declan Kelleher. I'm chairman of the European Policy Centre's Governing Board, and on behalf of the European Policy Centre, I'd like to welcome you all here today. It's a great pleasure for me on behalf of the EPC to welcome you and basically to launch our new European Defence and Security project. Now, you may be asking, why us and why now? And the EPC has certainly covered many aspects of European foreign security and enlargement policy, international trade, development and economic security, health and climate issues. We have projects on NATO, on security in the Black Sea and the South Caucasus, on enlargement, on managing multifaceted relations with China. But we've never previously dealt specifically with defense and military matters in such a focused way as we're going to do from now on. And perhaps, like the European Union itself, we were all lulled into a false sense of security after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the happy decade and a half at least, that followed. There was a belief that we'd entered an era of perpetual peace, at least in Europe, and that the European Union's methods of rules-based supranational governance and its soft-powered toolkit of trade, aid and regulatory alignment, and the geopolitical heft of the single market, which has always been there, were all that was needed to make Europe secure, and that defense was for NATO, not for us. So the establishment of this new project within the EPC's Europe in the World program represents something of a Zeitenwende for the EPC, to coin or borrow a phrase. We recognize that Europe and its interests have to be protected and defended from powers who do not share our values or our interests and who seek a very different international order from us. We believe that the EPC, with its integrated and holistic view of security, military, economic, demographic, and climate, and its transnational networks, is well placed to add value in this area. The project would bring together multiple stakeholders, civilian, military, industrial, and financial, to devise ways to break down the barriers to making Europe better able to develop its own defense capabilities. And we will harness the EPC's reach beyond the Brussels bubble in national capitals and across the world, and we will work with our extensive network of think tanks. So this work starts today. We will study how to make the European Union and NATO crucial and very important partners. National governments and coalitions of the willing work better together to strengthen European defence capabilities, and how to harness the financial community, the private sector, local authorities and civil society in a joined up, as I say, holistic, whole of society defence and resilience effort. We've recruited a great team to work with our existing senior advisors, policy analysts, and researchers on this project. Juraj Majcin, previously program manager for peace, security, and defense at Friends of Europe, has joined us as a policy analyst. He will work alongside Mihai Sebastian Chihaya, who has been working on European foreign and security policy issues at the EPC. Paul Taylor, a very distinguished and veteran journalist and former senior fellow at Friends of Europe, joins as a senior visiting fellow. Jamie Shea, former Deputy Assistant Secretary General of NATO for Emerging Security Challenges, who was already a senior advisor and member of the EPC Strategic Council, will also be a senior visiting fellow with the Defence and Security Project. In addition, Maria Martisiuta, a former NATO official who works in the EPC's transnationalization program, will join the Defence and Security Project part-time. And this summer, we will welcome Chris Kremidas-Courtney, an expert on hybrid and cyber warfare and emerging and disruptive technologies with a long career in the US military and NATO, as the project's third senior visiting fellow. It's also great to see Benedetta Berti, who has just become a senior advisor to EPC on the panel today, along with Timo Pesonen, Director General from the Commission, and Her Excellency Ambassador Anita Nergaard of Norway. And of course, Norway and the EPC have close relations. We hope that many of you who have joined us today, whether you are already members of the EPC or not, will engage with this program, bringing your expertise and support to the project project. We want to promote both a change of mindset about defense in Europe and practical solutions to the challenges our continent faces. With that, I'll invite Paul Taylor, who will tell you a bit more of the project, invite him to introduce the speakers and moderate the debate. Thank you very much, Paul.
Thank you, Declan, and good afternoon, everybody. Is this working? It is. Delight to have so many people here today in the room, and I know we have a big online audience as well. At least we have a big registered online audience, so I hope they're there. I invite the speakers to come up onto the podium. First of all, Timo Pesonen. So he's the first Director General of DG DEFIS, Defense Industries and Space, and he's previously somebody who's a long experience in. If you'd perhaps take the other end, a long experience in European Union affairs, both for the Finnish government and for the European Commission. And I got to know him when he was head of cabinet of Commissioner Olli Rehn. In the great days when enlargement was a big issue, and it's coming back again, so that's great. Next, I'd like to invite Benedetta Berti. Benedetta, who's come sit there, an academic researcher, particularly expert on non-state security threats, terrorism, in the days when that was, NATO's meat and drink rather than continental warfare. But she's head of the Secretary General of NATO's policy unit, which are the people who look into the future. And that's a really important function. I think that we're also going to benefit from her wisdom on that this afternoon. And last, but certainly not least, Ambassador Anita Nergaard of Norway, who's Norway's ambassador to NATO and has a very long experience in NATO affairs. I think you're on your third sentence in Brussels at NATO, so welcome to you. A word or two about our program. I think our program can be summed up, our project can be summed up in a single sentence, which is we're looking for practical solutions that work to get the industrial, the financial, and the human resources we need for the defense of Europe. How do we get better defense capabilities? How do we make defense investable? Because it currently isn't investable for many institutional and private investors, and even for some of our public investment banks. How do we make sure that we are able to compete for the brain power we need in the technological field, both for the armed forces and for the defense industries? How do we get a larger skilled workforce into the defense industries? All of those human capital questions. And what effect does that have on our economy overall? Does putting our economy onto more of a semi-war footing, say, is that good for the civilian economy or bad for the civilian economy? And how do we adjust for that? How do we actually get the industries to produce at scale? What will it take for them to really substantially step up production? Do we need redundant production capacity that some countries such as Finland have? And who takes the lead in that? So I'm going to stop there because those are really the key questions that this program is going to be looking at, and I hope that today we'll get a really good introduction to those topics. So without further ado, I'd invite Timo Pesonen to give us his introductory remarks.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Declan. Old familiar faces in new functions. Always great to get together. Actually, EPC has been very active on foreign and security policy already for a long, including, of course, the enlargement when my former boss used to be a regular speaker on the EPC events. I think this is very timely now, what you are doing. Actually, you should have maybe done it already like a year ago, but it's still better than never. Very timely because European Commission, we published our first defense industry strategy 5 weeks ago. After a relatively intensive, not that long, but intensive consultations also with the think tanks. I know that colleagues from various think tanks have been discussing with my colleagues very closely with NATO, with the allies, of course, with all the member states and the financial institutions. And I will come back to that maybe in our discussion in more detail. I think what I want to say is 4 years ago, when DG DEFIS was set up, we had very little team because we wanted to have like staffing, money, mission. So the mission at that time was a peacetime mission. It was to take moderate steps in the field of defense industrial research and development. So European Defence Fund, 8 billion fund for 7 years. Of course, the Commission proposal was higher, but then some member states in the Council actually cut it. But nevertheless, the first time we had from EU budget, EU taxpayers' money for defense purposes in research and development. So we launched an annual call for tenders for projects of different, let's say, capabilities and the future forward-looking. The main ambition is to increase the competitiveness of the European defense industry. It is not enough to be happy to be number 2 or number 3 in the world. In order to get, orders and purchases, you need to be the best. And there the European defense industry has been lagging behind. Let's be totally honest here. And that's why the Commission, that was President Juncker at his time, who already proposed a defense union. After seeing, the fragmentation of the arms production and different weapon production in Europe, we had, and we still have much more different types of rifles or you call them Kalashnikovs or tanks or fighters than what U.S. So U.S. industry is much more, let's say, focused, much more merged. But at the same time, when we talk about the future of European defense industry, we always want to keep the small and medium-sized enterprises with us. And that's why roughly 20 to 25% of the funding has gone every year in our annual calls to SMEs and startups. Because the innovation potential is there, including the disruptive technologies and how they may then later benefit let's say, the mainstream defense industry. So together with the member states, it's not the Commission who's calling the shots. We are facilitator. Member states together setting priorities on annual basis. Then we publish the tenders, companies apply. And of course, we have certain rules there. Like we have a rule that, the more you have countries with you, the more the merrier. So more cross-border cooperation, you get a little bit more funding. SMEs, you get bonus. So of course, we want to create a broad a European defense industrial base. Of course, the priorities are clear. It's the future corvette, it's the future fighter, it's the battle tank, it's the cyber shield, it is the space, of course, the space as an enabler for our defense. And I think these are clear. But how to get there? These are long processes. Research is one thing. Development until prototype, it takes long. So now, after a few years of work, we are gradually coming to the first prototype phase. And of course, what is needed next is the commitment of the member states to procure what they have been together researching and developing, because that's the way to have a market for European defense industry. And we need member states to procure together and to produce these equipment which are needed. The war changed this was the peacetime. The war came, the Bastard crossed the border, the war came. I mean, we all remember Thursday morning, February 24th, as many of us remember September 11. I saw September 11 alive in my office watching CNN. I mean, this is some movie that there is soon Tom Cruise or somebody coming, or Harrison Ford. That is actually it wasn't a movie. They attacked, the Twin Tower. They tried to attack Pentagon and the White House. It was a game changer in geopolitics and the fight against the terror. It changed the way we live. All the security parameters were renewed. And the similar on February 24th. Now, of course, all of us, we say, yeah, that was predictable. We are expecting Putin to do it. But at the end of the day, not so many were that convinced that he would really do it, even that there was a very, very strong intelligence information from the US in particular. But still, it was his decision to do it, to attack independent, sovereign European country and try to occupy the capital and to kill or prison the democratic elected leaders of Ukraine. So that was the wake-up call for all of us, for EU, for alliance. And the Putin, he made these three mistakes I am often referring. First, he totally overestimated his own military capacities, like all dictators, because they are shown fake news. They are shown that they have the most accurate and the fastest missiles, the fighters, the tanks, and the troops are the most motivated. What happened? They failed logistics in the beginning dramatically, as always they normally do. Secondly, he couldn't understand the fighting spirit of Ukrainian people and President Zelensky, who was offered a plane to fly away, take your family and run away. And he didn't do it. He didn't do it. What would have dictators done in these same circumstances? I leave it for you to answer. And the third one, he underestimated the unity of the West, unity of the European Union and unity of NATO. Day one, the sanctions have been put in place. EU and NATO working hand in hand on supporting Ukraine, on military assistance, on civilian assistance, and that continues and continues. And the latest, the big decision by US Congress and the President to release the package to Ukraine. So what we, European Commission, because we are not military operation, we work with defense industry. So we don't buy weapons. With our money, we don't procure. We don't tell member states what to buy and from where to buy. They are free to do it. So what we put together with Borrell, High Representative, was two instruments to support the ramping up and the production of the of defense industry. An ammunition support, and there was this, and there still is a dramatic shortage of artillery ammunition, in particular 155 millimeter, but others also. So we put together a fund worth of 500 million, which is a modest amount, but EU budget is empty. It is empty at the moment. So that was the money what the Commission was able to mobilize to finance 31 projects across Europe to speed up the increase of the ammunition production. And it is working. So the European industry has this famous capacity to produce 1 million rounds a year. It's already there. At the end of this year, estimate is 1.6, 1.7 million, and next year, more than 2 million on a permanent basis. Even this is not enough, so we have to take more measures to support our ammunition production. Then we have this was so-called ASAP instrument, as soon as possible, ammunition support for supporting ammunition production. And the second one is an instrument to support joint procurement, not to procure, not to give the money to procurement as such, but to incentivize member states to procure together, which is one of these problems in Europe, that each of the member states is doing its own. You have your own defense forces or defense analysts in defense ministries. They do their procurements, and then the cooperation is not as good as it should be. So with a little instrument, we are intensifying the procurement on ammunition on drones and missiles for Ukraine. The strategy, what I mentioned in the beginning, puts together all of this together. So I speak about investment journey, so that when our new instruments will be adopted, we will be there from the garage, from the innovation, supporting the defense innovation, to research, development, incentivizing the joint procurement, and supporting to production loopholes in the supply chain. We have no capacity to support the whole production, but to identify the loopholes together with the member states and then pool EU funding there. In our strategy, competitiveness is very important. Of course, when we are supporting Ukraine with ammunition production, you may say that that's not maybe the most, say, the latest innovative element of the global defense industry, but actually that's what is needed. So that's why we are focusing on that. But the drones is a combination of quantity and quality. So people say that there are a lot of drones, Ukrainians have a lot of drones, and they have a world leading capacity, also technological capacity, leaders. But of course, there also, I mean, there's a lot of Chinese technology, and I think we need to build more and more on non-Chinese technology also in drones. So I think there we need the European push there. I was in Riga last week, and they are very active. They take the lead on the Ramstein group, a kind of a drone alliance, a drone coalition, with several member states and allies together to boost the drone production and deployment to Ukraine. NATO. Everything what we do is compatible with the alliance. We are not competing. We don't even talk about collective defense. We say in our strategy upfront, NATO is the anchor of collective defense of those EU members who so is. Yeah. On standards, we are not proposing double standards or competing standards. We say NATO standards, TANACs, they apply. Of course, there is room for NATO to even improve the interoperability and the standardization, but that's another story. But it's clear. We have intensive staff-to-staff contacts. Benedetta, you remember, we have always our colleagues, we are talking and working together. We don't make so much noise about it, but it's really what we do in transparency, respecting each institution's role and treaty-based existence. We are based on treaty on European Union. We have the EU budget. We are European Union. NATO is an intergovernmental organization where the whole nature of the cooperation is different. And it's a military alliance, which we are not. Maybe finally on the financing, Paul, yes, we need funding. This public funding, these few hundred millions or 1.5 billion, which was now earmarked for our new program to promote everything I said is not enough. But it's a seed money. It's a carrot. So we need to mobilize the private investors, of course, the public investment banks, the European Investment Bank, but also the national investment banks, and to change this, broke this taboo that there is something unethical on defense. Like what? Like what? Protecting our way of life, our civilization. Is there more ethical than that? Of course. I mean, we have rules. We respect the UN conventions on arms, and clearly, I mean, there are things what we don't want to get financed. But if you talk about normal defense forces, I mean, we should get more private investments and the commercial banks. I was in an event early this year like this, and there was one young entrepreneur in the audience. I don't reveal from which country, but a big country from the Central Eastern Europe, big military power. He said that, I do mention the country, he said that, and it's not Finland. Finland is Northern Europe, so, and it's not the big. So he said that he tried to get financing for his small startup defense company, and he was rejected by the banks. Rejected categorically because you are defense. He changed the name of the company and he got the money. So is this sustainable, guys? I don't think so. Thank you very much, and I stop here.
Thank you, so much, Timo. It's a great kickoff. Perhaps we should call this the LoveSecEU instead of DefSecEU, and then we'll crowd in some more funding. Certainly, there are people I think I know in the room today who represent parts of the investment community, and I look forward to hearing from them as to what they think it will take to make defense more investable, and what kinds of instruments would they want to buy. Would they want to buy bonds or stocks in individual defense companies? Would they want to give loans? Would they want to buy collective European defense bonds, or defense bonds issued by small groups of European companies, perhaps, or countries around a particular project? All of those questions I'd like to hear from the audience. So I'm going to move across now to Benedetta. We've heard from the EU side. Benedetta, the NATO traditionally has left arms procurement pretty much to individual nations. I don't think it's unfair to say that you're, as Timo said, you're an intergovernmental organization, and that you are therefore you don't really seek to organize collective procurement or purchasing. So what role do you think NATO should play in future in encouraging a sort of rationalization of arms procurement? Take a microphone, just push the little button upwards so as to switch it on, and the floor is yours.
Yep. I did. And it does work. All right, Eureka. Thank you. Okay, so that's a very important question. I'll be as succinct as possible, and I would say that in my mind, NATO has historically played an important role in a series of key functions that sustain defense spending and acquisition. It has been about well, first of all, let's start with the basic. One thing that, let's start with the diagnosis of the problem that I think everyone on the panel would agree with, and that is for many decades, I've heard already the term peacetime mission, peace dividend, et cetera, et cetera. We were organized when it comes to our defense, and including our defense industry, under a peacetime model based on just-in-time, in which redundancy and spare production was actually seen as something that was neither desirable, neither financially nor strategically. So what we're trying to do, and it's a generational effort, is essentially to go from a peacetime model to one in which we prepare for persistent crisis, permanent competition, confrontation, and that requires a significant rehauling, re-energizing of our entire defense industrial base, defense industrial and technological base. So there's a few ways through which I think both NATO and the EU and individual member states are trying to haste that process. One is, of course, about generating that demand signal that industry absolutely need in order to scale up production, not just for the short term, but for the long term. And that's something you will hear time and time again. We want signed long-term contracts that give us the certainty that this surge in demand is not a bug in the system, but a new feature. We do that through a number of instruments. One is, of course, the fact that we have been leading for the last 10 years an important push in terms of increasing defense spending. It may seem obvious, but of course, if you don't have the cash, then everything else doesn't follow. So the fact that since 2014, we've been able to add roughly 600 billion in additional investments from non-US NATO allies already a step in the right direction. And of course, you all know that this year, as European allies, we are projected to finally meet this 2% benchmark, which really for some of our allies is becoming to be the bare minimum that we need to spend to keep up with the requirements. So one is defense spending. The other ways through which you incentivize production is by sending the right signals in terms of capabilities. Now, NATO has the NATO defense planning process. This is our key tool. It's a 4-year cycle through which, as you rightly said, of course, procurement is a national competency, but what you procure and how your procurement fits in the whole collective defense structure of the alliance is something that NATO actively engages each and every member states on by assigning capability targets that are necessary to, this very well, so I'm preaching to the converted, but to go to the second layer of how we practically do this. And the last NATO defense planning process that was agreed in February 2023 is the most demanding that we've had since the end of the Cold War in terms of the high-end war-fighting capabilities that are required to our member states. So that's already telling industry, we need that. We will need this for the foreseeable future, speed up procurement. And of course, the same is true for standards, which is a core NATO capability to ensure interoperability, both in terms of the type of weapon systems that you acquire, but also in terms of issues like how many of ammunition should you be stockpiling in order to be ready for any eventuality. And I'll stop here with one last point that I think is very important. We're also working more and more, and this is not something new, but we are accelerating and intensifying the work that we do to aggregate demand. So be demand aggregator through the NATO agency through a high visibility project. This is essentially facilitate multinational cooperation to procure, acquire, and develop capabilities that are required for the alliance. So what you get is cost benefit, economies of scale, interoperability by design, and investing in our technological edge. Just over the last few months, you had at least 2 major of these projects being signed for 2.4 roughly billion on ammunitions at the end of 2023, when the first delivery is already being delivered. And in January 2024, we had an additional 1.4 billion, if I'm not mistaken. So I'm just giving you a flavor of what NATO is doing to continue to generate convergence, aggregate demand, and boost interoperability.
So you talked about this kind of what NATO is doing in terms of trying to aggregate demand. Where do you think, from your perspective, where do you think the EU can add value?
I would go back to my initial point, which is the need. The challenge of the security environment we face is generational. So we are, I think, very aptly contributing to nudge joint procurement, joint acquisition, and based on the capabilities that we know European allies need to fulfill their key requirement to ensure the collective defense of Europe. But that's not something that we can do alone. And in this case, this fits actually quite seamlessly with what was just said by the Director General in terms of the EU as the regulatory framework. Potentially, it does have now the financial instruments, and I hope in the future that will only grow in size and scale, and that can really exponentially move us forward in terms of getting that demand signal that we need. And I think there's 2 functions, and I'll close here, but there's 2 really important needs for now. One is what was, I think, rightly addressed in the EU defense industrial strategy about the long-term development of this European defense ecosystem integrated within the broader transatlantic one. Oh. But the other one is the acquisition here and now of what Ukraine needs. Yeah. So that it can prevail. Right. And the 2 objectives are not in opposition, but they need to both be advanced simultaneously, I think.
I'll come on to that. Do you see a risk that NATO nations actually squandering some of this increased defense spending because they could do it in an uncoordinated way? Yes, I did. Well, to you and perhaps also to Timo.
Of course. I mean, it's a basic economic proposition. If you have same amount of supply and more demand, and that demand is not well coordinated, you're going to end up spending more for the same or for less. So that we know. Luckily, I would say between our NATO allies and our member states, that's a predicament that we're acutely aware of, and thereby that's why you have initiatives like the EU Defense Industrial Strategy, why through NATO we have the Defense Production Act. These are all attempts to get to overcome this very real pitfall of having a race to the bottom. We don't want to do that. That's not something that benefits us. And I think we are all very cognizant of it, and including our member states. They would be competing against each other. So it makes, yeah.
Before I come to Ambassador Nergaard, let me just say, for those of you who are following us online today, and for those of you who are in the room, we'll open it up for questions in about a quarter of an hour's time. So please prepare your questions. If you're online, I'm afraid we can't take live questions from you today, but we can take questions in the chat. So please put your questions or comments in the chat, and Maria is aggregating those and will give us the flavor of those later on. And finally, unfortunately, Timo Pesonen has to leave us a bit before the end because he's got an important meeting to attend. So if you've got questions for him, now's the time to get your retaliation in, as it were. Anita Nergaard, Norway obviously is a frontline state, whichever way one looks at it. You're a member of NATO. You're not a member of the EU, although you're in the single market. So when you see the European Defence Industrial Strategy, do you see it as an opportunity for collaboration with for Norway, or do you see it as a risk that Norway might be sort of shut out because you're not in the family quite?
Thank you, Paul. And just at the outset, thank you for inviting me. I fully subscribe to the to what Timo said about the how the world now looks, and of course Benedetta's description of where NATO is at. If I could just take it back one step, I think we are now with 2 years plus into this full-scale invasion. We are through the kind of initial shock phase of seeing the long peace, and we're now struggling to get the pieces in place and also to mobilize our societies beyond, say, policy circles, governments, parliamentarians, for the substantial uplift of security and defense that will need to be done over the long term. I completely agree that this is a generational effort and generational efforts that need to be made. So this is I applaud the fact that you're having this program, launching this program now. We've all of us, I think, done a lot and done what we can in the very short term. We've emptied our storages. We've really tried and be as helpful to Ukraine. We've even shifted our thinking and the way we talk about our assistance to Ukraine. It's less of assisting Ukraine and more of investing in our own security. So I think this is really, really important to have fully on board. And that also means, I think, that what NATO now does with looking at both defense investment, but also how to help allies plan and coordinate better on defense is hugely important. We need the transatlantic community to work together. And then Norway, of course, as you said, we're not in the EU, we're a NATO ally. We certainly we're very supportive of the EU's efforts to strengthen the European pillar, as long as it is in complementarity with NATO, as long as it is designed in such a way that it can benefit both European security and defense, but also the greater Euro-Atlantic space.
Yeah. Well, as Timo said, I think that cooperation between the EU and NATO works an awful lot better in practice than it yet does in theory. There's still sort of quite a lot of theoretical obstacles to it, but meanwhile, people are just getting on with it. So, Timo, you might want to say a word about that.
Not on that, but on Norway, because Norway is a full member of European Defence Fund, and also a full member of the ammunition support, and Norwegian companies have been greatly benefiting from the European defense cooperation. So Norway is actually if I allow me, Ambassador, a big winner in this, because you are really integrated into our internal market and in defense industrial cooperation.
I think it's. I'm really happy. The Director General said it. No, but I think. I mean, we are integrated. We are a member of the EDF. We have the same responsibilities and rights as member states, and we are supportive, as I said. So we do ensure that we become, as far as we can, become a member of the EU programs and efforts. We're now working on secure connectivity. That is an important area for Norway, and I think an area where Europe would want to have Norway on board. But yes, I think the results of the latest ASAP round, where Norwegian companies were among those selected, I think it shows really the benefit of ensuring that these programs are designed in such a way that we can draw on the entire, say, European base, not only within the EU countries, but also to design it in such a way that it's really helpful for the bigger mission.
I mean, your defense industries are very much integrated with European, with Finnish in particular companies, that seems to work. Let me ask you about the ammunition initiative, since you brought it up. So this, today is the last day, as it were, for us to have produced 1 million rounds of ammunition for Ukraine. Unfortunately, we didn't get there, although, as Timo says, we will over time be producing more than that per year. But we couldn't either produce or source all of that in 1 year.
Production capacity we have, but member states have not made procurements, i.e. then delivered them to Ukraine yet. This is the point.
Can you give us a figure, rough figure of
I don't.
How much
I cannot give the figure.
Yeah.
I cannot give the figure. I mean, there are different figures in public. It changes day and day. The Czech president took the initiative to pull together. It's an ongoing effort. So there's a serious work going on both in alliance, in EU and in US to support. But the figure, honestly, I cannot give.
So I was going to ask, Ambassador, from your perspective, what lessons do you draw from the way we went about this? What was the most effective way to procure this ammunition? Because we had various initiatives that were perhaps complementary, but there was perhaps a little degree of rivalry as well. There was a collective EU initiative through the EDA. There was things led by individual member states, Germany opening its procurement contract, the Czech Republic producing, going around the world, scouring for ammunition and getting contributions together. What lessons do you draw from all of this? What works best?
Well, maybe first of all, just to come back to what you all, I think, alluded to, is that in this very short-term urgent phase for Ukraine, we need to focus on deliveries. So it's very, very good to ramp up production. We are doing that as well. We should all do that, but we need to focus on deliveries. What is actually delivered in country for Ukraine? And there, I think we're not doing as well as we should be. I think the SecGen was also quite clear on that in Kiev the other day. I think looking at what we have done and participated in, Paul, I think what works is contracts. Contracts work really well. I mean, companies do respond to contracts. It's almost banal, but if you give them the contract, they will produce it. So at least, that is where you need to start. European countries need to do procurement. They need to issue long-term substantial contracts. Companies will then often also self-organize a bit into that space. Contracts is important. Yeah. Then there might be an issue of access to capital and other impediments. But start with contracts.
Yeah, just one more word on contracts before we come to access to capital, which is a big one. I guess the question goes to Timo. You know, as you said, you started with a pretty small staff. You didn't have anybody in the commission who had experience in arms procurement, and in all of this. Even today, you have a relatively small staff in DG DEFIS, and the European Defence Agency also has a small staff. I asked somebody there how many people they had working on the full-time on this joint procurement of ammunition for Ukraine, and they said, oh, about a dozen. That seems very small when you think that a country like Germany has 8,000 full-time staff in its arms procurement agency. Is there a problem of scale there? And how are we going to get to the scale we need, or is it not, you know, not the EU's ambition to get to that sort of scale?
It's a little bit how you look at it. I mean, as I said, you know, in my few introductory words, that I mean, we are not procuring. So I don't have people procuring weapons. So what we do is we are mapping the industrial capacity in Europe, and we would like to do that even more, member states allowing, so that we could have a better kind of a European arms sales mechanism in the future, a catalog when the European countries would see, I mean, what is available in Europe, what is needed in Europe. Of course, member states may have sensitivities that you don't want to make everything known by everybody, but grosso modo, in the big picture, to have a more, let's say, synchronized knowledge, what do we have? And then, I mean, aggregating the demand. I mean, it's a real like chicken and egg situation. European Defence Agency is not procuring either. I mean, they have put in place kind of framework agreements for member states then to make the procurement. So the procurement as such are done by the national procurement agencies. One element in our strategy is that we want to give technical assistance to those member states who don't even really have defense procurement capacities, who have one phone call to one big country where they go if they need something. So a little bit to diversify this, I mean, to have their own national procurement defense agents. I think this is our objectives.
And that fits in with the sort of historic role of the commissioners, of the commission as the institution that helps the smaller states to save themselves from being eaten up by the bigger member states.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Let's come on to finance. What would it take to get more private sector investment in defense in Europe? We've talked about public investment and the need for that, but what about, a lot of it's got to come from the private sector. What's your view? I mean, when you talk to people, you hear about ESG policies and how it's not possible, it's not regarded as ethical. You hear about people who are concerned about taxonomy, although the Commission says there's no problem with taxonomy. Just generally, it seems like the public investment banks in Europe are not exactly giving the lead in this either, the signal to the investment community, hey, it's okay, it's kosher to invest in defense. How do we get there, Timo?
Paul, you answered indirectly already yourself. I mean, the public investment banks like European Investment Bank, they need to lead by example. And the European leaders, European Council are insisting European Investment Bank to change its lending mandate to allow lending to defense as such, not only dual use. But I always say that the public money can never do the trick. You need to have the private investors and the private banks open their books. And this is something I would like to hear actually in the room if there are investors and what is required. I mean, is it like guarantee of a longer term commitment to defense industry, like this generational challenge we have, that, I mean, people speculating how long will the war take, etc., which to my mind is a useless speculation because the threat will remain. Yeah. And we need more capacities. And when the member states are increasing, the NATO allies are increasing their budgets to at least to 2% defense budget of GDP. Somebody speak about 3% already, and they are already there. And Paul, you remember during the euro area crisis, when IMF was insisting Greece to cut its defense expenditure drastically, and Greece were against, and the Commission, we were a bit like hesitant, but then we understood the Greek needs, and the Greek didn't cut as much as some might have liked. And luckily so, because Greece is one of the big spenders. So I think this kind of, investors need a kind of a longer term perspective of the that defense industry is worth of investing. And it is actually, if you look what's happening in the US, it's always been a good investment.
Benedetta, do you want to say a word about that, about getting people to, I mean, would it, for example, here's a simple one. What if the next European Council were simply to make a public declaration that defense is a public good and therefore is by definition, the defense of the EU is an ethical investment? Would it make any difference?
I think it's more for Timo than for me, but for music to my ears from where I stand. But I would also, I would just add that I think I would say it's a good start, but of course, in order to really move the needle, there are some regulatory constraints that need to be addressed, as was just said. And there has to be, at the end of the day, financial long-term incentives that materialize in the form of long-term commitment and signed contracts to deliver orders for multiple years, so multi-year frameworks that give you that certainty that you can ramp up your business in a way that is sustainable. But your question is more complex because it's really, I mean, maybe it's not, but the way I read it, it's just how do you restructure our entire society and mobilize it in a way to support to borrow a Finnish term, a total defense construct in which everyone is actively seized in matters of national security one way or another. And I think that's really where we need to go.
Norway, you have big public investment funds and pension funds and the oil fund, as it's called. Do they invest in defense? What are their limits? And is there things that you think might be worth changing?
Well, I think when it comes to institutional investors and ESG, I think signals from our political leaders could have an effect actually on sensitizing, perhaps convincing people that being engaged in national security and defense, in protecting our way of life, our values, is actually ethical. So I think it is important to start there. I think we also need, we need kids to be interested in this at university or PhD level. We need entrepreneurs to want to work with ministries of defense or within the defense field, dual use and defense. So it's a larger mobilization, as you said. When it comes to our sovereign wealth fund, they have certain categories of weapons that they don't invest in, but those are limited. And I think also perhaps, NATO is working on and agreeing policies, including for responsible use of new technologies and weapons, and perhaps that could also serve as an assurance to investors that companies that follow these policies should indeed be seen as ethical.
Right. It's your turn in 1 second. So my one more question to Timo, and then I'll turn it over to the floor and to our online audience. Timo, there are many elephants in the room, but one of them is the country that I used to know best. Do you?
I was waiting for the question.
Let me put it this way. Do you still consider the UK to be part of the European technological industrial base, the defense industrial base? And if that's the case, how do we include the UK in all of this?
Well, let's remember what happened. And I don't mean how the UK, and I don't mean
on my memory forever.
I don't mean how the UK people voted in their referendum, because they have full right, the democracy, to vote as they wanted to vote. But then the British government wanted to exclude defense cooperation and space cooperation out from the Brexit negotiations. So that's where we are. So UK is a third country. Has rights to apply for EDF funding with certain conditions. Same goes with the Horizon funding for space research and development. So that's the reality. I mean, how can it be changed? It's up to the UK government to draw their conclusions and then to discuss with the European countries. But I think of course, I mean, it's a NATO ally, and what comes to European Union, UK is not a member.
And all of our
nor a member of EA as Norway.
And all of our defense industries are still so intertwined. Think of MBDA, think of Thales, think of Leonardo, think of Airbus. They all have production in the UK as well as on the continent and so on. Benedetta, you would say what?
Just a very quick note on this, that I think you cannot argue with facts, so I will not, but I will just say that from a collective defense standpoint, that this is one of the clear issues where you can see a clash, maybe it's too harsh of a word, but a potential lack of convergence between, on the one hand, industrial interest, and on the other hand, strategic interest. Because from a strategic perspective, the defense of Europe absolutely does need the UK defense industry. And same is true when it comes to support for Ukraine. Just this week, the UK announced a permanent 3 billion commitment, multi-year commitment for Ukrainian military aid. It again pushes us in the same direction. And I mean it as a good thing. It is a good thing that our defense industry is transatlantic and integrated. That's what contributes to our technological and defense edge. So we want to keep it that way.
So yes, we want the UK in. Yes, it's naturally part of the defense of Europe, but given what the UK did, the ball is in the UK's court to make the first move and to make an approach. But we know that Timo's door will be wide open if they do.
Yeah. But well, whether not to knock my door, but to Paris, Berlin, and other capitals. But I think there is one fun thing is good to remember here. When we talk about defense industrial cooperation, we talk about mobilizing the EU budget. Mm-hmm. So the European taxpayers' money, and that money is meant for European industry plus Norway, because Norway is an EA member.
Paying member.
Yeah, yep. Exactly. So that this is, let's say, the distinction where we're the big picture. Of course, Benedetta, what you say about a transatlantic alliance and the capabilities, etc. But when I look from my perspective, this is an unfortunate situation where we are.
Great. It's your turn. You've been a very patient audience. If there's anybody from Ukraine, incidentally, we tried to get a speaker from the Ukraine president's office, and that didn't in the end work out. But if there's anybody who would like to say a word from Ukraine, we'd very much welcome that. In the meantime, can somebody take a microphone? And we have a first question to the lady in the front here. Going up. And there is the input from the internet as well. So please introduce yourself, just quick comment or question.
Yes, thank you. My name is Alice Stolmeyer. I'm the founder and executive director of Defend Democracy. Congratulations to the EPC for their Zeitenwende. So far, this exchange has been mainly about investing in hard security and defense. But given the urgent need for building societal resilience and civil preparedness, are there any thoughts or plans for investing in soft security?
Good question. Thank you. Thank you. Next question over here.
My name is Hans Vos. I'm a former Council of Ministers European Union official. I live 300 meters from where is the residence of the Secretary General of NATO. I went to a bank over there, which is a Dutch bank, and I asked, can you organize me a packet of actions on defense? Because it's needed and it works well.
Share portfolio.
Yeah. So I got a reply already since a couple of months. No, we cannot do that because there is an agreement among the banks that we should abstain of that. So I would like to ask, especially to Mr. Pesonen, do you know about this agreement, or is this just silent? And also what Paul said, that maybe it's needed that top down, that is a declaration of the European Council that all means of investment should be used to protect us.
Thank you. The third hand for this round was here, and then we'll come back to the panel.
Thank you very much. Maxime Siro from FN Europe, policy intelligence company. Last Friday, if I'm not wrong, the French and the Germans signed an agreement on a future MGCS system. Quite simply, I was wondering what your take was on that, if you saw that as maybe a landmark or a case study for the future, if that would have any impact on the fragmentation of the defense industry, and in particular in Europe. But whoever wants to answer that question.
Thank you. Timo, there were at least 2 questions for you, so why don't you start?
First on I'm not aware of that kind of agreement between the banks. I don't know, I mean, in what capacity they are capable of doing that kind of, but I believe you. I mean, these stories we hear. On the soft security, of course, I mean, it's part of the concept that, I mean, when I work with the defense industry, I have to focus now on the situation on the ground, in particular, you know, to find every ways to support Ukraine and to ramp up our own armament production to be able to defend ourselves. So we are defending ourselves. But the soft security, I mean, in a way, probably you describe it. I mean, we are of course working with Ukraine, for example, in Ukraine in many fronts. I mean, Ukraine is now in the enlargement process, so we have people working in that respect with the separate instruments and specific instruments to support, you know, the whole Ukrainian society, and of course the future rebuilding, reconstruction, which is still far from here to come. But we are, I mean, supporting the industry in Ukraine also. I mean, it brings jobs, it brings growth for stability for Ukrainian people. So I think in that respect, we have the broad view. Oh, I mean, every time France and Germany get their act together, European Commission is happy, but maybe Benedetta can be more analytical on the military importance of that deal.
Yep. May I also say
Yes,
something very quickly? So first on the soft hard security, allies will not be surprised to hear that I have abandoned that term because it inadvertently provides the impression that the non-hard security is less important. And as she knows better than me, I strongly believe that these two are blurred in a ways, not necessarily by design by us, but our strategic competitors and adversaries through civil military fusion, through using all the instruments of power at the same time, have really rendered to some extent this distinction that we still make much less valid. And so I would say, despite the focus of this panel is on industrial production, I'm 100% with you that even when you talk about re-energizing and strengthening the defense industrial production of Europe, you cannot do that without thinking about supply chain security, security of critical infrastructure, including 5G, including civilian satellites. And you're very soon brought into a discussion about civilian assets and softer issues. So I agree, there's no distinction anymore.
I thought that was a brilliant answer, actually. So just to come back to that and really emphasize the importance of looking at total defense or comprehensive security. This is the situation we are in. This is how our competitors or others act. And we see it also very clearly in Ukraine, of course, how everything to do with services or infrastructure for civilian use is attacked and instrumentalized in any case. So full support for that perspective.
Let me just say on behalf of the project that, the Franco-German, yeah. I mean, I would say the Franco-German thing, it's been a long time coming. These are programs that unfortunately have an elephantine gestation cycle. And it's even elephantiner, if I can coin a comparative, when it comes to the future combat air system. And I think there are real problems. You know, yes, it's great, and one hopes that lots of countries will aggregate around it and get work share and so on. I think that the way of dealing with work share is still very antiquated and not efficient, but whether we can bring that into our program, I rather doubt. That's miracles, as they say in the old Jewish joke, take a little longer. But you know, again, we have two competing future combat air system projects in Europe. Now, I can't tell you much about the future. As a journalist, it was hard enough doing the present, but the future, forget about it. But one thing I can tell you is there will not be two future sixth generation European combat air systems flying in the skies of Europe, because the costs are just so, there'll either be one or there'll be none, and everybody will be flying the F-35s or its successor. So I can only pray that those projects come together into a single viable European future combat air system. And a word to Alice, really, I couldn't agree more. Part of what we will be doing will be in this project will be about societal resilience as a whole, and we'll be doing a tabletop exercise where we bring in people from civil society, from emergency services, from the private sector, which owns most of the infrastructure nowadays, and from government, both civilian and military and so on, to try and work through some of these scenarios that involve disinformation, hybrid attacks, the impacts of climate change, and so on, and all sorts of things. And Chris Cremidas-Courtney, who's joining us in July, is the kind of acknowledged specialist on this stuff. And so, yes, it's very much part of what we want to do.
Paul, I have to leave, but just to say that, what President von der Leyen, she asked former Finnish President Niinistö to prepare a report on whole society preparedness. And that is, let's say, top on the agenda now, and it will be a key element of the future Commission agenda and the priorities. So looking forward to that report. First elements coming out already in end of June, and the report as such in October. And there, any ideas, please contact his staff and give your input.
Well, let me just take the chance to thank Timo very much please give him a round of applause. We look forward to working with you and your team. Good luck.
Right, thank you.
Great. So let's now go to our online participants. Maria, what's coming in on the wires, as we used to say in the newsroom?
Thank you. So a lot of questions actually very similar to the ones asked in person here in the audience, but there's a question about EIB's lending. And yes. I know we have a representative of EIB here. And so if you're willing to take the floor, what is the prognosis for the current efforts to convince the EIB to change its policy, which forbids it from investing in weapons, ammunition, and military infrastructure?
Yes.
And relatedly, how can we speed up EIB Group's action plan to support Europe's defense industry? Thank you.
Well, would our guest from the EIB like to say a word right now?
Yes, thank you. My name is Oliver Cusworth. I'm the EIB's Brussels office and covering space and defense policy. And thank you for the question. What I would say is the EIB has been doing a lot of work on how we can push our support for the defense sector. Specifically, earlier this month, we released this defense action plan, which for those of you who don't know, it's 5 pillars of how the bank can do more for the sector. Essentially, that's changing our definition of dual use. It was mentioned already that we can only support dual use, but we're going to change the definition to allow a sort of a large universe of projects that become eligible under a new definition. Secondly, we're going to change our rules to allow more support for SMEs in the defense sector. Thirdly, we're setting up a new entity at the bank, which is a sort of one-stop shop for defense, which will bring together not just the bank's financial products, but our subsidiary, the EIF, which supports venture debt and private equity, and also our advisory services to sort of make it easier for defense companies to approach us and get our financing. And we'll be launching some new partnerships as well, also with the European Defence Agency.
That all sounds like it's ways of essentially being more flexible within the current framework. But we heard Director General Pesonen actually challenge you to change your rules. Is that something? Is that on the agenda? Are you going to have a debate in the bank among the shareholders, who are, after all, the EU member states, on changing your rules as for regards investing in defense?
Well, the guidance that we received from the March European Council was to change our policy to support the defense sector while protecting our funding model. So you know, the EIB is a AAA rated bank, and we issue bonds on the markets. So we have to be cognizant of what are the ESG policies of the investors that buy our bonds. That being said, the defense action plan that I've just outlined does involve changing our policies, and it does go quite far, and in fact to the limit of what we can do within those policies. And just a final point, I mean, that's the press release, but I'd also make the point that the EIB board of directors, it's the finance ministries. And I think one thing we see is that there is a need for more discussions between finance and the defense ministries, because this is a bit of a separate dialogue going on, and I think that's something which we would like to see more of.
But it's very interesting here, because there's a real chicken and egg loop, isn't it? That you feel constrained by the ESG principles that your investors, your bond buyers, apply. And yet they feel constrained by the fact that you don't, haven't very much supported the defense industry. So it's a kind of vicious circle in some way that we may need to break out of to get more defense investment.
That's right, and we issue bonds globally as well. It's not just in Europe. So this is a global issue on ESG for defense.
Yeah. Great, thank you very much for that. There's a gentleman here at the front who wants to ask a question. A gentleman over there. If there's somebody here who would recognize themselves as being a representative of investors, private or banks, that would like to speak, that would be great too. Sir.
Thank you, Paul. Luigi Scazzieri from the Center for European Reform. I had a question for the director, but I will ask a similar one, but slightly different, to Benedetta, which is on how to make sure that NATO standards are actually upheld, because they've been around for quite a while, and yet it seems that the implementation is quite lacking on the side of the allies. So does NATO have, or is thinking perhaps of, some mechanisms to ensure that there is bigger take-up of these standards?
Enforcement of standards. Could the EU perhaps use its regulatory possibilities to enforce those NATO standards? Benedetta, why don't you go? I like that question.
It's a great question, and I think, well, on what the EU could do on NATO standards, I would probably defer to my EU colleagues, but I would say that I very much agree with the sentiment that was expressed earlier about leveraging EU development and acquisition and procurement tools to acquire capabilities that are designed as critical by NATO and that are in compliance with NATO standards, so that we do all this while preserving and enhancing interoperability. That's the broad policy message. Then more in the weeds, I believe that actually this is all part of the same broad conversation that we're having about restructuring and rebuilding a defense mindset after decades in which we underspend in defense. We underdevelop our own capabilities, and the issue of standards, of course, I don't want to say it became dormant. That is not the case, but it was less politically salient, and it was probably more of a technical issue than it is today. So as part of that, NATO is re-enhancing its capability to provide the advice that allies need in terms of ensuring that the interoperability is maintained. I'll close by saying it is really a story of a glass half full, I would say, because if you go old, I don't want to do the whole history lesson, but if you see what level of interoperability NATO allies have in terms of ability to exercise, work together, conduct missions and operations shoulder to shoulder, that is unprecedented in the history of the world, essentially. When we talk with our partners in the Indo-Pacific that have a very different system, there's no Indo-Pacific NATO, and we exchange informally lessons about building C2, interoperability, they are astounded about how interoperable European and North American forces are. But of course, That does not mean that there's not room for improvement. There is, and there is also room to accelerate our work, especially as the cycle of defense innovation is becoming faster and faster, and especially when it comes to integrating emerging and disruptive technologies, unless we're ahead of the curve, then we develop standards when it's too late. So there are a number of challenges, but I think we need to recognize that we are in the best position. There are no other defense cooperation groupings in the world that have this level of interoperability. So,
gentleman over there.
Yeah, Helmut von Glasenapp. I'm Secretary General of the European Long-Term Investors Association. I'm happy
there we found an investor.
Address your strong invitation from investors. So I'm representing public investors, public national promotional banks and institutions, to international ones. The EIB is an observer, but we heard about the EIB story already, which is not fundamentally different from the discussions our members have. I would like to touch on a few aspects. First of all, I think investors and banks, be them private, be them public, they now?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm not 100% sure whether there's really a funding gap from private investors. There is money available, and I hear a lot of private investors saying we would love to go in this sector, but then we are back to the rating,
Can I ask you a question then? If, let's imagine that EU countries were able to agree on issuing defense bonds, a significant volume of defense bonds to fund joint procurement programs, would your members, do you think your members would regard that as a good investment, good safe investment, and that they would want to buy such assets, or would they be wary of them for one reason or another?
Sounds promising. So,
well, there you are.
Yeah. I'm not sure that this is the task for promotional banks, because if a promotional bank, a public promotional bank, buys bonds from the state, sovereign debt,
yep,
then you don't have the money in the projects. It's in the pockets of the state, and they can buy tanks or ammunition. Yes, that's possible. But we are speaking here about the European defense industry, and this would not help significantly to improve the situation we are talking about. So this is, I think, not exactly what member states should do or would do. Let me point on the EIB once more, because the EIB has indeed a very clear leading function, because many of the smaller national promotional banks, they receive funding from the EIB, and depending on their lending policy. So then you are again in the discussion we heard about. Yep. And the last remark I would like to make, the 2834 multi-annual financial framework. I would suppose that the discussions will be even more tough than they have ever been, because member states need a lot of money at national level for their defense spending. So what will be left for the European Union? Difficult to say, and we have a lot of demands, not only defense and security industry. We have the Green Deal, we have digitalization, we have, and I can continue the next 15 minutes. So I think the European Union, the Commission, needs to make their mind how to address all these needs, which are ongoing. I have, our members are offering the leverage instruments or financial instruments similar to the EIB. That's the answer we are giving, but we will see a fundamentally different MFF outcome, as all of us can imagine, and not everybody will be happy in the future.
Thank you very much. We're just about out of time. Those of you who can stay, you're very welcome to come next door. There'll be a cup of coffee, cup of tea, a glass of wine just next door, in the room next door, to celebrate. We've got one question coming in there from the floor.
Thank you very much. My name is Nazar Babitska. I'm from CREAP, International Public Affairs and Consultancy Company, and incidentally also an Ukrainian. So I'm exercising my small quota for a Ukrainian question. Regretfully, my question comes after Timo Pesonen left the audience, but it relates to what I'm referring also to the European defense industry strategy, which also has a very, let's say, compelling reference to the need to integrate the newly emerging Ukrainian defense industries and to bring them into the European defense supply chains. Obviously, I'd say the advantages are manifold, starting from the fact that Ukrainian defense industry are the constant breeding ground for innovation, as they learn on the front of the new phenomena that would be extremely beneficial for European militaries or NATO militaries for that purpose. Also, I can give you another figure that currently, after 2 years of war, the Ukrainian defense industries, mostly private ones I refer to, have an aggregate production capacity of approximately $9 billion per year, but the Ukrainian procurement budget can, let's say, satisfy only half of that. So my question is as follows: to what extent, what are the practical, let's say, regulatory and perhaps technical obstacles to realize that, let's say, proposal of vision in the European defense industry strategy? What can be advised, at least to the Ukrainian companies, to be able to partner effectively with their European counterparts and to apply for certain, let's say, shared funding in order to realize the advantages they have at home, also in the interest of the European organization, the European defense industry? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, you'll notice that Declan Kelleher is not, in fact, Timo Pesonen, but I know whether Declan, whether you could, with your long EU experience, say a word or two about that. And then I think Benedetta wants to have a word. And Ambassador Nergaard is going to have to leave us in a second. Are you going to have to go right now, or you got? Is there a final word you'd like to say before you leave? Ambassador?
Well, thank you for having me. This will be an interesting program. I feel that we're at the start of a conversation that will have to continue. A lot of issues have come up. Just to our Ukrainian colleague as well, this is certainly also at the top of our list when we now look at our coming national defense industry with an action plan. We're encouraging our companies to co-invest in Ukraine. We do need to provide more air defense and ammunition, but we also have to make sure that the regulations and licensing and so on is in place. We've done that for our part. So this is you're absolutely right. This is something we need to do together. And I fully agree on the innovation cycle in Ukraine. It's quite incredible to see an innovation cycle of perhaps 6-7 months coming from a NATO system where the defense planning process is traditionally 19 years.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you very much. And thanks very much for your participation. And I heard a very encouraging, unless it was incoming fire, sound from next door. So Declan, you know the race is on now.
Okay. Thanks, Ambassador. Thank you. See you soon. I very much agree with what Ambassador Nergaard said. I think two, if you like, framing points I want to make on this. One is that where we are on European defense is not the classical process of European construction of defense, the integrationist approach, going back to the 1950s, 60s, 70s, is something that's been precipitated by existential challenges and primarily the Russian aggression against Ukraine. And also there is a pragmatism there, and particularly, as we've heard today, the very close working relationship between the EU and NATO, which is absolutely essential to this. So, I mean, I don't think there are necessarily going to be too many chasse gardées of the old kind of turf type that define the relationship there. And to go to your question, it really depends on how the point is put and how it's framed. I think there's an inherent flexibility now, as long as certain basic budgetary and other rules are observed, to be as forward-looking as possible. So I would see your question as, I think, how the question is put, how the proposal is put. If it's put in the same way you just asked the question, I think it's a very, very strong runner indeed. But I think it's something which certainly is, I would be optimistic about, given the fact that this move now on EU defense is not being hamstrung by the old kind of tribal suspicions between the EU and NATO, and also the fact, the understanding that the EU and NATO must move together in extremely close lockstep on this. So I just add that as a final point. I hope I haven't gone over time too much.
And Benedetta, you want to say a final word as well?
Sure, and I'll be very brief, because when we hear something pop in, it's not time for long speeches, but just to reiterate the point that was made, NATO is working actively with Ukraine on issues surrounding defense innovation, and I want to say that is absolutely 100% in our own interest and investment in our own security. There's so many lessons that we can hear about, that we can learn from what Ukraine is doing in terms of defense innovation, disruption, integration of emerging and disruptive technologies. And yet again, just to close by saying that's yet one of the many examples as to why we can see a fully integrated Ukraine in the Euro-Atlantic area as a key net contributor to our collective security. And I think we should always remember that as we talk about our support for Ukraine.
Absolutely. Thanks very much. And as I say, we tried to include the government of Ukraine, in fact, in some way in this launch event. Weren't quite able to, but I'm very glad, therefore, that you got up and spoke on that important point of integrating with the Ukrainian defense industries and learning from them. That's it from us. More details of both our planned events in the coming months and the kind of questions we're going to be tackling in this concept note, which you should have received. If you are members of the EPC and want to get engaged with this, please make yourselves known to our team next door while we're having a drink. If you're not members and want to get involved in this, well then now's the time to join. And we look forward to welcoming you. And we will do more public events, but now we're going to go into a process of some really serious closed-door dialogues, and those will involve civil society and the human resources and resilience part of it, as well as the industry piece and the finance piece. Thank you for your attention, and have a good afternoon. Join us for a drink.